What happens when Hollywood's most straight-talking actor sits down with television's most provocative host? The answer will shock you. Mark Wahlberg's appearance on Piers Morgan's show was supposed to be a routine promotional interview. It quickly spiraled into one of the most heated confrontations in television history. Before we dive into this explosive encounter, make sure to subscribe and let me know in the comments what you think about celebrity interviews getting this intense. The tension was palpable from the moment Wahlberg walked onto the set. His usual, confident swagger seemed more pronounced than usual, and Morgan's trademark smirk suggested he had something brewing. The interview began, innocuously enough, with Morgan welcoming his guest with his characteristic British charm. "Mark, wonderful to have you back on the show," Morgan began, settling into his chair with that familiar lean-forward posture. "You're looking well, very well indeed." Wahlberg nodded curtly, his Boston accent cutting through the studio air. "Thanks for having me, Piers, though I gotta say, after what happened last time, I wasn't sure you'd want me back." Morgan's eyebrows raised slightly, a hint of mischief dancing in his eyes. "Oh, come now, Mark, that was just a spirited discussion about your film choices. Nothing we couldn't handle like gentlemen." "Spirited discussion?" Wahlberg shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. "You basically called my last 3 movies garbage on national television." "I called them commercially disappointing," Morgan corrected, his tone maintaining that infuriating calm that had made him famous. "There's a difference, though I suppose the box office numbers speak for themselves." The first crack in Wahlberg's composure began to show. His hands, which had been resting casually on the chair arms, now gripped them slightly. "You know what, Piers? Let's talk about numbers. How are your ratings doing these days? Because from where I'm sitting, you're not exactly setting the world on fire." Morgan's smile never wavered, but there was a sharpness to it now. "My ratings are perfectly healthy, thank you very much. But we're not here to discuss my career." "Are we? We're here to discuss yours. And frankly, some of the choices you've made recently have been questionable at best." "Questionable?" Wahlberg's voice rose slightly. "I've been in this business for over 2 decades. I've worked with some of the greatest directors alive. What exactly makes you qualified to judge my career choices?" "Well," Morgan said, leaning back with theatrical confidence, "I've interviewed thousands of celebrities. I've seen careers rise and fall, and I know talent when I see it. And lately, Mark, what I've been seeing from you is a man who's lost his way." The studio seemed to hold its breath. Wahlberg's face darkened, and his Boston roots became more pronounced in his speech. "Lost my way? You sit behind this desk, asking the same boring questions to every guest who walks through that door, and you think you know something about my journey. I know that the Mark Wahlberg who made The Fighter and The Departed wouldn't have signed on for half the projects you've done in the past 5 years, Morgan shot back, his British accent becoming more clipped. "It's like you're chasing paychecks instead of pursuing your craft." Wahlberg stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You know what? This is exactly what I expected from you. You invite me here under the pretense of a professional interview, and then you ambush me with this nonsense." "Sit down, Mark," Morgan said, his voice carrying a hint of command. "We're in the middle of a conversation." "No, we're in the middle of you trying to make yourself look smart by tearing down someone who's actually accomplished something," Wahlberg replied. But he remained standing, his hands now clenched at his sides. Morgan's composure began to crack. "Slightly accomplished something? Mark, your last film made less money than my autobiography." "At least I'm not making a living off other people's misery," Wahlberg fired back. "You built your entire career on controversy and cheap shots. That's not journalism, that's exploitation." The host's face reddened slightly, but he maintained his seated position. "I've exposed corruption. I've held celebrities accountable. I've given voice to important issues. What have you done lately besides cash checks and phone-in performances?" "Phone-in performances?" Wahlberg took a step closer to the desk. "I put everything I have into every role. Just because you don't understand the craft doesn't mean it's not there." Morgan finally stood, matching Wahlberg's aggressive posture. "The craft? Mark, you've been playing the same character for the past 10 years. Angry Boston guy with a working-class background, it's not Shakespeare." "And you've been playing the same character for 20 years, Wahlberg countered. "Smug, British guy who thinks he's smarter than everyone else. At least my character has heart." The two men were now facing each other across the desk. the pretense of a friendly interview completely abandoned. Morgan's professional mask was slipping, revealing something more personal underneath. Heart? Morgan's voice dripped with disdain. Is that what you call it when you take roles just because they offer you $20 million? Is that heart, or is that greed? Wahlberg's face contorted with anger. You don't know anything about my motivations. You don't know anything about the business. You're just a talk show host who thinks he's a film critic. And you're just an actor who thinks he's a producer, a businessman, and a philosopher, all rolled into one. Morgan snapped back. The truth is, Mark, you're out of your depth in half the projects you take on. Out of my depth? Wahlberg's voice was getting louder now, his Boston accent becoming more pronounced with each word. I've produced films that have made hundreds of millions of dollars. I've built businesses from the ground up. What have you built, besides a reputation for being a professional irritant? Morgan's carefully maintained composure was cracking further. I've built a media empire that spans continents. I've interviewed world leaders. I've broken major stories. I've influenced public opinion on issues that matter. Influenced public opinion, Wahlberg laughed bitterly. You've annoyed people into watching your show because they can't believe someone can be that obnoxious and still have a career. The insult hit its mark. Morgan's face flushed deeper, and his voice lost its measured tone. At least I don't have to rely on explosions and one-liners to keep people interested in what I have to say. No, you rely on cheap attacks and manufactured controversy, Wahlberg shot back. At least when people watch my movies, they're entertained. When they watch your show, they're just waiting for you to say something stupid so they can complain. About it online, Morgan stepped around the desk, bringing himself within arm's reach of Wahlberg. Stupid. I graduated from one of the finest institutions in England. I've written best-selling books. I've run major newspapers. What's your educational background again, Mark? The question struck a nerve. Wahlberg's face darkened further, and his voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. My education came from the streets of Boston, from working my way up from nothing. I didn't need Daddy's money to buy my way into some fancy school. At least I can form a coherent sentence without dropping my consonants, Morgan replied, his attempt at wit falling flat in the heated moment. There it is, Wahlberg said, his voice filled with disgust. There's the real Piers Morgan, the elitist snob who thinks he's better than everyone else because he talks like he's got a stick up his backside. The studio crew was now openly staring, some reaching for their phones to capture what was quickly becoming television history. Morgan seemed to realize he was losing control of the situation, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. I don't think I'm better than everyone else, Morgan said, his voice strained. I just think I'm better than someone who thinks tough guy posturing is a substitute for actual talent. Wahlberg's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Tough guy posturing. You want to see tough guy posturing? Keep running your mouth and you'll find out what the difference is between acting tough and being tough. The threat hung in the air like a physical presence. Morgan's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't back down. Are you threatening me on my own show? I'm telling you what happens when you push people too far, Wahlberg replied, his voice deadly. Serious? And you're about 30 seconds away from finding out. Morgan's face went pale, but his journalistic instincts kicked in. He knew he was sitting on television gold, even if it meant putting himself in the line of fire. So now we're resorting to physical intimidation. How very Boston of you, Mark. How very British of you to hide behind sarcasm when you're in over your head, Wahlberg fired back, taking another step closer. You think this is a game? You think you can just sit there and tear apart everything I've worked for, and I'm supposed to smile and take it? The studio's security team began moving closer, sensing the situation was spiraling out of control. Morgan noticed the movement and seemed to gain confidence from their presence. I'm not tearing apart anything, Morgan said, his voice regaining some of its earlier smugness. I'm simply pointing out that your recent career choices suggest a man who's more interested in making money than making meaningful cinema. Meaningful cinema. Wahlberg's laugh was harsh and bitter. You wouldn't know meaningful cinema if it bit you on your pretentious backside. You're a tabloid journalist who got lucky enough to land a talk show. I'm a respected broadcaster who's interviewed everyone from presidents to pop stars, Morgan countered. I've covered wars, I've broken major stories, I've held powerful people accountable for their actions. You've made a career out of being a professional pest, Wahlberg shot. Back, the only reason people talk to you is because they have something to promote. Nobody seeks out Piers Morgan for his wisdom. Morgan's jaw tightened visibly. And nobody seeks out Mark Wahlberg for his acting range. You play the same character in every single film, just with different costumes. At least I'm not playing a character, Wahlberg said, his voice dripping with contempt. This whole pompous intellectual act you put on, it's pathetic. We all know you're just a guy from Surrey who learned how to talk down to people. The personal nature of the attack clearly stung. Morgan's composed facade cracked further. Better than being a high school dropout who stumbled into fame and thinks that makes him qualified to lecture others about integrity. There it is again, Wahlberg said, his voice rising to match his anger. The education thing. You think because you went to some fancy school that makes you better than me? I've learned more about life in 1 week on the streets of Dorchester than you learned for years at whatever privileged institution Mommy and Daddy sent you to. At least I can articulate my thoughts without resorting to violence, Morgan replied, but his voice was shaking slightly now. Violence? Wahlberg spread his arms wide in a gesture of mock innocence. Who's talking about violence? I'm just having a conversation. This is how real people talk when they're not hiding behind some fake accent and a borrowed vocabulary. Fake accent. Morgan's voice pitched higher with indignation. I'm British. You ignorant. You're putting on a show, Wahlberg interrupted, just like you do with every guest who sits in that chair. You think if you sound smart enough, people won't notice that you don't actually have anything interesting to say. Morgan stood up straighter, trying to regain his authority. I have plenty of interesting things to say. I've written best-selling books. I've hosted successful shows on multiple continents. I've built a media brand that nobody respects, Wahlberg finished. You want to know why your ratings are in the toilet? It's because people are tired of watching some middle-aged guy with delusions of grandeur try to make himself feel important by belittling his guests. The camera crew was now openly filming, realizing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Morgan seemed to become aware of this and tried to regain control of the situation. Mark, perhaps we should take a break, and no, Wahlberg cut him off sharply. You started this. You wanted to make this personal, so let's make it personal. You want to talk about career choices. Let's talk about your career choices. Phone hacking scandals, getting fired from newspapers, getting canceled from other shows. You're not exactly batting 1,000 yourself. Morgan's face went from pale to red in an instant. Those were complex situations that required complex situations. Wahlberg's voice was incredulous. You invaded people's privacy for profit. You destroyed lives for headlines. And now you have the nerve to lecture me about integrity. I was doing my job as a journalist, Morgan said defensively. Sometimes that requires making difficult decisions. Your job was to sell papers and boost ratings, Wahlberg countered. Just like your job now is to create controversy so people will watch your show. The difference is, at least I'm honest about what I do for a living. Honest? Morgan's voice cracked with disbelief. You're an actor who pretends to be other people for money. How is that more honest than journalism? Because I'm not pretending. Right now, Wahlberg said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. This is who I really am. But you're still performing. Even when you're angry, even when you're embarrassed, you're still trying to be this character you've created. The accusation seemed to hit deeper than the previous insults. Morgan's carefully constructed persona was being systematically dismantled on live television, and he was powerless to stop it. I'm not performing, Morgan said weakly. I'm conducting an interview. No, you're conducting a hit job, Wahlberg replied. You invited me here so you could ambush me with prepared attacks. You thought you'd get some viral moments at my expense. Well, congratulations, Piers. You got your viral moment. Morgan looked around the studio, suddenly aware of how badly the situation had gotten away from him. His producers were signaling frantically from behind the cameras, but he seemed frozen, unable to regain control. Mark, I think we've both said things we didn't mean, Morgan tried, his voice attempting to find its earlier authority but falling flat. I meant every word, Wahlberg said coldly. The question is, did you mean what you said, or was it just another performance? Of course I meant it, Morgan snapped, his temper flaring again. Your recent films have been commercial disappointments, and your acting has become increasingly one-dimensional. Those are facts, not opinions. Facts. Wahlberg laughed harshly. Here's a fact for you, Piers. My last film made more money in its opening weekend than your last book made in its entire print run. Here's another fact I've been nominated for: 2 Academy Awards. How many nominations do you have for your journalism? Awards don't mean everything, Morgan replied, but his voice lacked conviction. No, but they mean something, Wahlberg countered. They mean that people who actually understand the craft recognize talent when they see it. Unlike some people who think watching movies makes them experts on making them. I don't claim to be an expert on making films, Morgan said defensively. I claim to be an expert on entertainment. And from an entertainment perspective, your recent work has been boring, Wahlberg suggested. Uninspired. Commercial. Yeah, I've heard your little speech, but you know what's really boring? Sitting across from some pretentious hack who thinks he's Roger Ebert when he's really just a gossip columnist with a talk show. The comparison to the late film critic seemed to especially annoy Morgan. I'm nothing like a gossip columnist. I deal in facts, in real stories, in substantive journalism. Substantive journalism. Wahlberg's voice was filled with mockery. You spent 10 minutes earlier talking about which celebrities I've dated. That's not journalism. That's TMZ with a British accent. Celebrity relationships are part of the human intrastory, Morgan protested. People want to know about the personal lives of public figures. People want to know because you tell them they should want to know, Wahlberg replied. You create demand for gossip and then pretend you're just supplying information. It's manipulative and dishonest. Morgan's face was now fully flushed, and his voice was beginning to shake with barely controlled anger. I don't manipulate anyone. I ask questions that need to be asked. If you don't like the questions, maybe you shouldn't be in the public eye. Maybe you shouldn't be asking the questions, Wahlberg shot back. Maybe the world would be better off if people like you found something more productive to do with their lives. The insult was devastating in its simplicity. Morgan stood there, speechless for a moment, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find a response. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight with rage. People like me. What exactly does that mean? It means people who make their living by tearing others down, Wahlberg explained with cold precision. People who contribute nothing positive to the world, but somehow convince themselves they're important because they have a platform. I've contributed more to public discourse than you ever will, Morgan said, his voice now openly hostile. I've exposed corruption. I've held politicians accountable. I've given voice to important issues. You've sensationalized other people's problems for profit, Wahlberg countered. That's not public service. That's exploitation. The studio had gone completely silent except for the 2 men's voices. Even the crew seemed transfixed by the brutality of the exchange. Morgan looked around desperately, realizing he was losing the battle on his own show. You know what your problem is, Mark? Morgan said, his voice now trembling with a mixture of rage and desperation. You think because you came from nothing that gives you some kind of moral superiority? But success doesn't erase your past, and it doesn't make you a better person. Wahlberg's eyes narrowed dangerously. My past? You want to talk about my past? At least I own mine. I don't pretend to be something I'm not. I don't hide behind some fake intellectual persona to make. People forget that I'm just another guy trying to make it in the world. Fake intellectual persona. Morgan's voice cracked with indignation. I've read more books than you've probably ever seen. I've studied at institutions you couldn't even get into. I've engaged with some of the greatest minds of our time. And what has all that education gotten you? Wahlberg asked, his voice filled with contempt. A talk show where you spend your time attacking people who've actually accomplished something with their lives. If that's what passes for intellectual achievement in your world, then maybe your world isn't worth being part of. Morgan's face went through a series of expressions, from anger to shock to something approaching panic. He was being destroyed on his own show, and he seemed powerless to stop it. I've accomplished plenty, Morgan said weakly. I've built a successful career in multiple fields. I've influenced public opinion on important issues. I've made a difference in the world. You've made a difference. Wahlberg laughed bitterly. The only difference you've made is making people more cynical about the media. You've contributed to the destruction of trust in journalism by turning everything into a circus. I didn't destroy trust in journalism, Morgan protested. I've tried to hold people accountable, to ask the tough questions that need to be asked. No, you've tried to create moments like this, Wahlberg said, gesturing around the studio. You've tried to manufacture controversy, because you know that's the only way people will pay attention to you. Without conflict, without drama, without other people's pain, you're nothing. The accusation seemed to hit Morgan like a physical blow. His shoulders sagged slightly, and for a moment, the fight seemed to go out of him. That's not true, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? Wahlberg pressed. When was the last time you had a guest on this show who left feeling good about the experience? When was the last time you used your platform to actually help someone instead of just helping yourself? Morgan's mouth opened and closed several times before he found his voice again. I'm not here to make people feel good. I'm here to ask the questions that need to be asked. No, you're here to make yourself feel important, Wahlberg replied. You're here to convince yourself that you matter, that you're more than just another middle-aged man desperately clinging to relevance. The personal nature of the attack seemed to break something inside Morgan. His carefully maintained composure completely crumbled, and his voice rose to a shout. I am relevant. I have millions of viewers. I have influence. I have power. You have an audience of people who watch because they enjoy seeing others humiliated, Wahlberg said coldly. That's not power. That's pathetic. Morgan's face was now completely red, and his hands were shaking with rage. You don't know what you're talking about. You're just an actor. You pretend to be other people for a living. You don't understand real life, real issues, real problems, real problems. Wahlberg's voice was incredulous. You sit in this studio, every day protected by security, surrounded by assistants, making millions of dollars to ask famous people uncomfortable questions, and you think you understand real problems. I understand more about the real world than some pampered Hollywood star who hasn't had to worry about money in 20 years, Morgan shot back. Pampered. Wahlberg's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. You think growing up in Dorchester was pampered. You think working construction jobs to pay for acting classes was pampered. You think fighting for every role, every opportunity, every break was pampered. That was a long time ago, Morgan replied, but his voice was weaker now. It was yesterday, Wahlberg said firmly. Every day I wake up knowing that everything I have could disappear. Every day I remember where I came from and what I had to do to get here. But you've convinced yourself that you deserve this, that you're entitled to sit in judgment of others. Morgan seemed to realize he was losing the battle completely. In desperation, he reached for the lowest blow he could think of. At least I didn't spend my youth as a criminal, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The studio went completely silent. Even the crew stopped what they were doing and stared. Wahlberg's face went completely still, and when he spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. What did you just say? Morgan seemed to realize he had crossed a line, but pride prevented him from backing. Down, I said. At least I didn't spend my youth as a criminal. It's public record, Mark. Everyone knows about your past. Wahlberg took a step forward, and this time, the security team moved closer. You want to talk about my past? Fine, let's talk about it. I made mistakes when I was a kid. I paid for those mistakes. I learned from them. I grew from them. I became a better person because of them. Some mistakes can't be forgiven, Morgan said, his voice gaining strength from what he perceived as moral high ground. Forgiven by who? Wahlberg asked. By you. What gives you the right to judge me? What makes you think your opinion matters? I have a platform, Morgan replied. I have a responsibility too. You have a responsibility to mind your own business, Wahlberg interrupted. You have a responsibility to treat people with basic human decency. You have a responsibility to use your platform for something other than your own ego. I'm not going to be lectured about responsibility by someone who what? Wahlberg's voice was now openly threatening. By someone who owned his mistakes. By someone who worked to make amends. By someone who actually did something positive with his life. Morgan's face was a mask of barely controlled fury. You think making movies is positive? You think entertaining people is some kind of public service? I think it's more positive than what you do, Wahlberg replied. I think making people laugh, making them think, making them feel something, is better than making them angry and divisive and cynical. I make people think, Morgan protested. You make people angry, Wahlberg corrected. There's a difference. Anger isn't thought, it's just emotion. And you're very good at manipulating emotions. Morgan seemed to realize that he was completely outmatched. His show, his studio, his territory, and he was being dominated by his guest. In a final desperate attempt to regain control, he made the decision that would end the interview. "I think we're done here," he said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "Are we?" Wahlberg asked, his tone suggesting he was just getting started. "Yes, we are," Morgan said more firmly. "This interview is over." "Good," Wahlberg said, straightening his jacket. "Because I was getting tired of watching you embarrass yourself." Morgan's face went white with rage. "Security, please escort Mr. Wahlberg out of the building." "Are you serious right now?" Wahlberg asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "You're having me kicked out because I told you the truth about yourself." "I'm having you removed because you're being disruptive and unprofessional," Morgan replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "Unprofessional?" Wahlberg laughed harshly. "You spent the entire interview trying to tear me down, and I'm the one being unprofessional." "You threatened me," Morgan said desperately. "You made physical threats." "I never threatened you," Wahlberg replied calmly. "I told you what happens when you push people too far. That's not a threat, that's a warning. But I guess you're too scared to tell the difference." The security team was now standing directly beside Wahlberg, waiting for clear instructions. Morgan looked around the studio, realizing that everyone was watching him make what was clearly a cowardly decision. "Please leave," he said quietly. "Gladly," Wahlberg replied, but he made no move toward the exit. Instead, he looked directly into the camera. "You know what the real tragedy is here? This guy has a platform that could be used to actually help people, to have meaningful conversations, to make a real difference. Instead, he uses it to feed his own ego and create division. That's not journalism. That's not entertainment. That's just sad." "Get him out of here," Morgan said to security, his voice now openly desperate. As the security team moved to escort him out, Wahlberg turned back to Morgan one final time. "You know what, Piers? I actually feel sorry for you. This is your life. This is what you've chosen to do with the time you've been given. And when you go home tonight, when you're alone with your thoughts, you're going to know that everything I said was true." "Just go," Morgan whispered, his voice completely defeated. Wahlberg nodded to the security team and walked toward the exit with his head held high. As he reached the door, he turned back one final time. "Oh, and Piers, good luck explaining this to your producers." The door closed behind him, leaving Morgan standing alone in his studio, surrounded by his crew, all of whom were staring at him with expressions ranging from shock to pity. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every moment of his humiliation.